Gregory, who's calling in from Tennessee and wants to know what happens in the human brain when one becomes convinced. Gregory, welcome to Talk Heathen.
Hello, this is Gregory in East Tennessee. Thank you for having me on the show.
It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for waiting for a whole hour to come on the show.
Oh, well, that's fine. I've been listening to the other callers and making notes, so hopefully some of the things you've said to them and what they've said will make this a better discussion as well.
Okay, so go ahead. What's your question?
Just for a little background, I used to be strong theist. I spent 10 years in Eastern Orthodox Christian seminary, was on the fast track to becoming a priest, and something convinced me along the line that this was not going to be my life's path. I started listening to atheist shows, particularly Matt Dillahunty's shows, and when I started listening, I was firmly in the camp that belief involved choice. Because the dictionary definition of belief uses the word accept, and you look up accept, and it seems to apply there's a choice there. So I vehemently disagreed with Matt until he convinced me otherwise, and I've noticed he started using the phrase become convinced when someone changes their belief. So this is kind of, we've come this far in the journey away from belief being a choice, and now people are becoming convinced of this or that. So now I'm very interested in how does one become convinced? Why is one person convinced by an argument while another person remains unconvinced?
Right. Can we just check just before we go on, if you're on speakerphone, can you turn off the speaker and just go into normal?
No, I'm not.
Thanks.
No, I'm not. I'm just on the
okay.
headset and I have the show muted.
Okay, no probs. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because I guess like the last thing we just said on the last call, I would love to believe in an afterlife, even if there wasn't one, because the idea of just stopping existing stresses me out. And if I could just choose to believe in an afterlife, then I would. But I think it's like a lot of things. Like I can't choose to believe that, I can fly, because I just know that's not the case. Like I could say that out loud. I could say, oh, I believe that I can fly. But it's not actually something I believe. And I couldn't convince myself without some kind of evidence that I could. And it's the same with believing in an afterlife or believing in religions. The question of why some people believe some evidence and others don't believe the same, aren't convinced by the same evidence. I mean, that's quite a deep question, I guess, and that's kind of like what these shows are all about.
Right.
But I think critical thinking and stuff can show you can learn how to evaluate evidence, and it can show you that something that might seem convincing on the surface, it can teach you that there's like a logical trick going on here or a sleight of hand, which makes something seem convincing at first when actually it's not a good, rational, logical argument. And so you will see people who will approach something and they'll see it and they'll, oh, that sounds like convincing to me. And then when you point out there's actually a logical fallacy at the root of it, then it comes crumbling down. And some people will be practiced at looking for logical fallacies, or would have just been explained how this argument has logical fallacy before, so then they won't be convinced by the same argument. So yeah, there is a skill in assessing evidence that you can learn.
Yes, I agree, and it was learning critical thinking skills and being able to recognize logical fallacies when they're presented that, better prepared me to either accept or reject a case when it's made. And I noticed we've got some adjectives here from previous calls. They were talking about justified belief or reliable evidence. So it's not just enough to present evidence, it has to be reliable evidence. If you're going to assert a belief, you're going to have to present something to justify it that's not a logical fallacy and that is in line with critical thinking. And what you mentioned, the fear of death, it's like the fear that's brought on by an existential crisis is not enough to convince me that this otherwise unsubstantiated claim is true. So I've been trying to develop a thought experiment to help me understand this, and kind of pretty simple, could be along lines of like two identical twins approach a chasm, and there's a rope bridge, across. They both have, they both decide there's a good reason to cross, but one decides, okay, the rope bridge is going to hold me, and the other one decides, no, it's not. So obviously it's the same bridge, the same physical conditions, so why is one person convinced it's safe to cross and the other one isn't? Is it about acceptable risk, just the amount of risk we're willing to accept to get what we want?
I think sometimes it's just down to brain chemistry, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're all different people. And that's why, you know, when I look at your question, what happens in the human brain when one becomes convinced? Frankly, I feel underqualified to answer it because I've never studied psychology. And I would imagine there's a far more deeply satisfying answer to be yielded from someone who has, you know, made it their mission in life to understand how the brain works and how the brain responds to different propositions. But intuitively, I would guess that it's going to be
instead, is what you're saying.
Intuitively, I would guess that it's going to be different from one human to the next, and that different people are going to have different thresholds when it comes to what is a persuasive proposition and what isn't.
Yeah, and I think if we're like talking down to like brain chemistry and like brain structure, then and if we accept the assertion that there's like no soul or some mystical supernatural component to your decision making, then your decisions are going to be based on the structure of your brain, which changes as you grow, as you get older, based on, you know, various factors, and the like chemical levels and stuff. And we might be able to in the future come in and poke around a little bit or put some chemicals in and just convince you of anything. I mean, that might be possible. And I think it seems reasonable from the evidence that I've seen and my understanding of human brains and thought patterns and stuff, that when we say what is it to be convinced, like on a sort of a physical level, there will be some kind of set of structures and chemicals which are present in some form. I mean, it's very complicated. I don't think it's going to be as simple as like there's a connection here or not, but it's, you know, there's going to be some combination of structures and chemicals which will be present in one of your identical twins and not in the other one. And I think, you know, that'll be based on how they've grown and the experiences they've had in life and, well, basically nature and nurture.
Yeah, and well, anything even just as simple as alcohol. Someone who's intoxicated with alcohol might be more easily convinced that something is a good idea, whereas if they were sober, they would be like, wait a minute, that's going to have consequences. So,
for example,
that it's to do with brain chemistry.
For example, when Katy is intoxicated, she might look at this and think, now there's some tasty mayonnaise.
I would never. That is a slur against my character. I would never be so drunk as to tolerate mayonnaise.
So there is a threshold there. Okay.
Well,
you brought that on this show, just me.
Sorry.
Sorry, Gregory. It suddenly got very personal here.
How long has the potato salad been left out in the sun? Do I want to believe that it's going to make me sick if I eat it or not? So I definitely hear where you're coming from on that. When I was younger, I was very easily convinced by theologians of their point of view, and I think that's why religion, you know, get them while they're young and then susceptible to easily believing. Yep. But I would take the same arguments that the theologian made to me to someone else, and they would point out how, you know, that's just fallacious, or here's the hole in the argument. So I was convinced by an argument, but someone else wasn't, and they pointed out the flaw in the argument. I would take their counter argument back to the theologian, and of course they would have a counter argument to that. So I think you're right. It comes down to a personal bias, and if some people are easily swayed by a personality or the methodology of the presentation, or by a fallacy that seems convincing at face value, but when you look at it critically, it falls apart.
So when we're talking about like get them while they're young, that it's worth pointing out that we do understand that there are parts of people's brains which are specialized in certain things, you know, responsible for decision making, responsible for restraint and all these different kinds of things. And people's brains develop as they grow, and certain areas in your brain finish developing at different times. And certainly like your ability to do critical thinking and your ability to reason and make logical arguments is something that isn't fully developed in teenagers and young adults. So that's, it is true that you will hear an argument and be convinced when you're younger, and then you present it to someone who's older than you, and they'll be more likely to, be able to see through the reasoning, but not necessarily, because like you say, it depends on your genetics and your experiences and what you've been taught and all kinds of different things. But for sure, even growing up, the physical structure of your brain can be something that's holding you back in being able to reason through these arguments.
Yeah, I remember thinking when I was younger, they'd tell me something. I said, well, I don't know if or I'd think to myself, I don't know if I necessarily believe this, but I'm not in a position to argue with them, and if I do, it's going to make me an outsider to the group. So I'd rather be a joiner than be ostracized, but I don't want to be a follower because I'm not convinced yet. So it kind of put me on this middle ground between, okay, I associate with this group, I go along with what they're doing and what they're saying, but I don't necessarily hold these beliefs as absolute myself. I want to wait and see kind of attitude. Being young, you really think, well, I don't know yet, so I'll wait and see. And of course, later on, it usually turns out that their arguments are full of holes and not appeals to emotion are very common.
Yeah.
Well, for the record, I think it says a lot about you that when you are presented by these arguments, you do the digging, you do apply skepticism and critical thinking, and it's hopefully brought you to a better place in life. Unfortunately, we do need to move on to other calls, but I just want to thank you again for being on hold for all that time and for calling in to Talk Heathen.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure, and I'm going to continue to try to refine my thought experiment to, make it more precise and give more insight. So thank you to both of you.
We're back with that.
Happy Independence Day.
Thank you.
Happy Dependence Day.
Yes,
come on.
Dependence Day.
Some people just aren't getting the script here. But yes, perhaps now would be a good point in the show to talk about Patreon. There are some patrons whose names should be read out because they are helping to support the entire project. It's not easy to host a show on this level. There's lots of nuts and bolts involved. So people like
we're some of the nuts.
We're the nuts. We're the British nuts.
Yeah.
Eric Tweet, your support through Patreon is very much appreciated, as is that of CJ Dennis, Dingleberry Jackson. Thank you so much. Balaam's Donkey, that takes me back. And Paul Lear gets an honorary mention. We also have seemingly winning the competition for interesting names, the Great North American Dingaloo. So thank you to all of you for your incredible support on Patreon. Again, the address to support the show on Patreon is patreon.com/Talk Heathen to me. Now, Katie, would you like to take some more calls?
I guess.
It's kind of what we do.
Yeah.
To be honest.
Let's do it. I'm super ready. I'm ready.
You're not allowed to back out of it. I asked you the question giving the impression that you could back out of it, but a little bit like the monarchy, once you've got it, you've just got to stick with it, unless you're America. So,
well, I was feeling more enthused until you cracked out the slime earlier. So,
when you say slime, do you mean that?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, right. But it says seriously good mayonnaise. And,
yeah, but like the Christian church claims it's good as well. So,
but that's probably product placement. Sorry, Talk Heathen. But that's testimony. That's testimony, isn't it? So we should just accept it. Anyway,
mayonnaise is a religion.